Hello, everybody. My name is David Marsh. I'm the chairman of OMFIF, and it's a great pleasure to introduce today Bob Dohner. He's an old hand on the Asian and international circuits. He's now a senior non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, the think tank in Washington. He was for more than 10 years the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Asia Affairs at the US Treasury. He had a long career even before that in the US government. He was also financial secretary looking at the whole financial monetary scene in Tokyo. So welcome, Bob. And first of all, when you look at the global response to the crisis that has now been rumbling on for more than 6 months, how would you assess the state of global economic cooperation today?
Well, David, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I was Treasury's representative in Tokyo during the Japanese banking crisis. And when I left Tokyo, I told friends, well, I'll never see anything like this again. And then, like all of Treasury, I was caught up in the global financial crisis, 2008, 2009. When we were on the way out of that, I told friends, I'll never see anything like this again. And this time, I've decided to keep my mouth shut. It's extraordinary. One has to understand how sharp and how deep the recession is. Paul DeGrauw put together estimates of global industrial production. It fell 15% in 3 months, much faster than during the global financial crisis or the Great Depression, and significantly farther than it ever fell during the global financial crisis. U.S. employment's fallen by 19 million people, about twice what it fell during the global financial crisis. In answer to your question, the response of fiscal and monetary authorities globally has been breathtaking and much greater than I ever would have thought possible coming out of the global financial crisis. The U.S. budget deficit will probably reach 17% of GDP this year. The German fiscal deficit probably reach 15% of GDP. U.S. personal income actually rose in the second quarter, and the Treasury's firm support lending was roughly $800 billion, $700 billion, or roughly 1 month's worth of U.S. payroll. So the response, even the emerging economies have been able to cut interest rates and to increase spending.
So every country has done its own thing, haven't they? But has it really been joined up? Would it be helpful if we had a resurgence of the Pittsburgh spirit, let's say, that we had after the global financial crisis? It seems to me that this has not been very coordinated this time around.
It's not been coordinated, but I think much of what made the Pittsburgh process, the G20 successful in the global financial crisis, was that incentives aligned early on, and everybody acted in a way which was mutually supporting. I think that's also true in the response this time. The G20 has been relatively restrained, so have the multilateral institutions. But I think what's extraordinary this time is the role of the Federal Reserve, both in stabilizing dollar funding markets globally, but also through quantitative easing, creating a situation in which emerging economies could cut interest rates, borrow without excessive fear of exchange rate depreciation. And in fact, you saw a massive outflow from emerging markets actually reverse after a month or two during this current crisis.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So you're saying that even though Mr. Trump, the president, may not get wonderful voting results in terms of his international collaborationist approach, he's not a great international coordinator, but you're saying the United States as a whole, taking into account the Federal Reserve, has done pretty well on an objective basis.
No, I think that's true. And the Fed is kind of unusual and interesting because it's being transformed into a reluctant global central bank. And I remember after the taper tantrum 2013, 2014, the extent of criticism that I got in international meetings about the need for the Fed to consult with and take into account the views of countries globally. The Fed had a extraordinarily powerful role in supporting dollar funding and the activities of emerging markets, I expect it to come under increasing criticism when and if the Fed policies reverse.
When we see that all that has happened, the Fed took the playbook that they had developed slightly haltingly 12, 13 years ago and played it out in a masterful way with many new instruments and many new types of engagement. And the amount of criticism that they got this time round was very muted compared with what happened last time when they were accused of bailing out banks and helping Wall Street rather than Main Street. Now, I know that people like Janet Yellen, actually, after she left, she did do a bit of lobbying in Congress to try to make sure that the Congress men and women wouldn't be critical. Why is it that the Fed has this time not come in for the same kind of criticism that it did last time? Also from the White House, of course, criticism has been fairly muted. You might say that's either a good or bad thing. Could you piece together all those different elements of the story, Bob?
Well, I think there are two reasons. First, it's fairly early days, and we're still in the midst of the crisis. And the second reason is that because of the political divisions in Congress and the difficulty of acting, particularly now on further stimulus measures, there's a tendency to rely on and to hope that the Fed will come through with actions that are not quite possible politically in the legislature.
Do you think that the Fed is actually keeping up some more weaponry up its sleeve? Because it's quite startling that the balance sheet, having gone rather quickly to $7 trillion, has remained at that level since the summer. Do you think that if the fiscal authorities don't come through with a stimulus package, they've been calling for that, everybody from Jay Powell downwards has been saying that, do you think then the Fed would come to the rescue over the next few weeks during the time when we will be somewhat paralyzed by the electoral process and also any transition which may take place? Do you think the Fed will be there to support markets, to support growth, and to support the economy?
Well, I think it's quite possible that the Fed will take further actions to increase asset purchases, to try to push down interest rates in the long end. But further Fed actions won't come to the rescue. We've come full circle to where we were in the 1960s, where currently we're all Keynesians again now. There's little that the Federal Reserve can do to further support aggregate demand. You see that in the increasingly desperate statements of Chairman Powell and others about the need for fiscal stimulus. It's unfortunate in the United States because I think we're heading towards significant premature fiscal tightening and reduction of income support. The back and forths of the president in the last few days about further stimulus packages, I think just underline the uncertainty and the tentativeness of which actions will take place so close to an election in the United States. We'll probably may well get a limited fiscal support bill, possibly for airlines, but I don't think we'll get anything like the kind of package that's needed to maintain fiscal support.
There is a danger, isn't there, that the United States may somewhat overreach itself. You said before that it may now be turning into a de facto central bank of the world rather than the central bank of the United States. So the question must be raised, how long can this go on for without there being some real deterioration in the status of the dollar as the world's supreme currency?
So I'm a dollar optimist, at least for the medium term. I don't think there's any other currency that can play the dollar's role. I think people tend to focus on the dollar as a reserve currency. But in fact, the most important role of the dollar is as an asset currency and as a transaction currency. And the framework, the pattern of international financial transactions, financial settlements, is pretty much a spoke and hub system in which the United States and the dollar is absolutely central. I think there's a tendency every time the dollar depreciates to predict the end of the dollar's role as a reserve currency. And I just don't see that yet.
Yes, the point about the role of the dollar, our old friend Stephen Roach wrote a fairly alarmist article in the Financial Times, and no doubt in other organs in the last few days, predicting yet again the end of the dollar and a huge fall in the dollar. Bob, as you say, you've seen many of those things before. If you had as many hot dinners as you've seen such articles, you would be tremendously overweight, I'm sure. But there must be a problem, though, because after all, the liabilities of the United States are now ratcheting up every year. That is because the world does trust the United States, and so foreigners put money into the United States, and so the liabilities ratchet up. If there were to be a currency that were to take over, it would have to be the euro. So are you basically saying in this ugly contest that we have worldwide, the dollar is the least ugly of them all?
I, I think that's probably a good characterization. I also agree with you that the euro is the only other candidate. Um, I don't think that either macro stability or is sufficiently assured, or that there's sufficient financial sector development, um, particularly with the UK leaving the euro area. I think that the prospects for the euro in the short term, probably the medium term, 5 to 10 years, are extremely limited as a successor to the
I mean,
dollar.
some people, some of my German friends would disagree with you because they'd say the fact that the UK is leaving the EU makes it easier for the euro to somehow consolidate. I mean, you may or may not believe that, but they say that the eternal naysayers, the people who always got in the way, the awkward squad, the Brits, they're now out. So now the French and the Germans and Italians are going to go and get on with it. As a long-time policy maker, do you think that's going to happen?
As a former policymaker or policy observer, I think the remaining members of the euro area will find new areas and issues to disagree about.
Bob, thank you very much indeed for this tour de force, and I'm really looking forward to further conversations with you. So all the best to you, and thanks very much for taking the time.
Well, thank you very much, David. It's been a pleasure.